The mechanical tension in this water tank mirrors the ideological state of the modern world. This ideological chaos is a calculated mutiny, powered by a specific psychological mechanism. All human beings operate with an innate, inescapable awareness of reality. We possess an internal knowledge of God as a righteous lawgiver, a truth stamped directly onto human consciousness. Because this knowledge is universal, unbelief functions as a moral and ethical problem. It is a choice to resist divine authority rather than a failure to perceive it. Suppressing this awareness requires significant physical and mental exertion. It is similar to the continuous energy needed to hold a highly buoyant object underwater. The moment the effort stops, the truth returns to the surface. What looks like a lack of evidence is actually a coordinated, exhausting containment strategy against the relentless upward pressure of truth. Paul diagnosed this behavior in Romans 1. He used the Greek term katakonton, which translates to holding back, restraining, or intentionally pinning something down. This term describes an active, continuous suppression of reality. It is a deliberate action taken by the mind to pin down the facts of our existence. If the disclosure of God's character is constant and plain, then secularism cannot be a state of neutral ignorance. Under this diagnostic, what we call a lack of belief is better understood as the active displacement of a pre-existing awareness. Because God's revelation through creation and human conscience is flawless, the rebel can never rest. The pressure to suppress the truth is as constant as the revelation itself. The cultural madness we witness daily is the friction generated by a society burning its kinetic energy to hold reality in place. To understand how rational people construct insane worldviews, we must look at the intellectualist framework pioneered by Gordon Clark. Clark argued that human volition is strictly governed by the mind's strongest convictions. A choice made independently of the mind's thoughts and desires is, by definition, uncaused. If our actions are not determined by our knowledge and character, they are merely random events. Clark argues that a will free from the intellect is a logical impossibility, a square circle. This formula shows the relationship between human agency and God's sovereignty. The human will, labeled W, operates entirely within the divine decree, labeled D. The finite creature cannot step outside this perimeter. The rebel can push the boundary, but remains structurally contained. Cultural rebels cannot act independently of the God they hate. Their very mutiny is governed by his structural parameters. When the unregenerate mind turns against the Creator, it does not abandon logic. It continues to reason, but it does so from a corrupted starting point. The mind executes an axiom swap, removing the foundational block, God's lordship, for a false premise, radical autonomy. It builds a sophisticated, internally consistent worldview on this lie. The logic is flawless, but because the foundation is false, the system fractures and collapses. Modern ideologies aren't necessarily illogical. They are structurally doomed to cognitive futility because their starting premise is false. These abstract mechanics of suppression operate at a corporate scale through modern socio-political systems. Wokeism executes this by swapping God's design for the subjective self. It elevates individual feelings to the role of creator, allowing the self to dictate identity, gender, and biological truth. Socialism executes the same mechanism on a macro level. It swaps God's creative ownership for the collective state, positioning government authority as the supreme source of truth and societal engineering. While they look different, both systems manifest the same underlying premise: radical creaturely autonomy. Whether the idol is the individual's internal feelings or the collective bureaucracy of the state, both movements serve the creature rather than the creator. Because both systems operate in God's universe using human reasoning, they rely on borrowed capital, a structural contradiction that exposes their dependency on the God they deny. This protest graphic highlights a fundamental tension. The secular activist claims morality is a fluid social construct, while simultaneously demanding absolute, objective justice for marginalized groups. The socialist operates on the same logic. They claim society is governed by raw materialistic power, yet they rely on objective, transcendent moral categories to condemn greed as an evil. neither movement can make their outrage intelligible without stealing God's hard-coded laws of logic and human worth. If truth were truly fluid, oppression would merely be the dominant group exercising its preference. Cultural rebels are effectively screaming at the lawgiver while using his own loaned air and his own moral law to write their manifestos. Secular conservatism routinely fails to combat these movements because it attempts to fight cultural decline using raw facts, biological data, and common sense politics. They assume they can argue on a neutral ground, a theoretical blank slate, or tabula rasa, where both sides agree on the basic rules of evidence. Facts bounce harmlessly off an ideologue because you cannot shame an internally consistent worldview using a standard of logic it explicitly rejected at its foundation. Addressing cultural symptoms without addressing the corrupted starting premise guarantees defeat. The ideologue isn't missing facts, they are suppressing the foundation that makes those facts meaningful. Participating in the illusion of a neutral ground is a surrender. It discards the only tool capable of dismantling the mutiny. The scriptural strategy for engaging the culture is direct axiological warfare. This tactic requires bypassing the symptoms and isolating the enemy's false starting premise. When the foundation is exposed, the entire system descends into cognitive futility. We must call out the enemy's stolen moral capital, demonstrating that they cannot formulate an argument for justice without implicitly relying on the Creator. Dismantling this mutiny requires moving past the search for a neutral middle ground. The strategy shifts to a unilateral proclamation of the written Word of God as the foundation of all reality. God's lordship is the supreme, non-negotiable precondition that makes reality, logic, and human worth intelligible in the first place.